Hey guys, Miss Sewing here, and in this video we're going to review the different ways that people protested during the civil rights movement. So when I say protest, we're talking about a way to show your disapproval, that you disagree with or object to a law or a policy. So some of the most common ways that people protested during this time period were through marches, boycotts, and sit-ins. These were three very common types of protests or tactics that were used, and I'll explain more about those in the next coming slides. We also associate Martin Luther King Jr. with protesting during civil rights. He is a guy who is known for nonviolent protests, also known as civil disobedience. I'm trying to write that small. Disobedience. I don't think that's spelled right, but y'all get the idea. He is very closely associated with bringing the problems of the lack of equality in our country, the unfair treatment of Black Americans, and showing that through protests through peaceful ways. Let's dive into some of these examples of well-known civil rights protests. First of all, we're going to start with Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks. These are two women who did basically the same thing, but we are more familiar with Rosa Parks' story in this country because it became quite popular. But Claudette Colvin should get credit as well. Both of these women refused to give up their seats on the bus. It was expected for Black women at this time period to give up their seats to white passengers. This was the law at the time, and they both refused to do that because it was obviously unfair. They were both arrested. Now, notably, Claudette Colvin was a kid. She was about 15 when this went down. Rosa Parks was, of course, a lot older. One kind of cause and effect relationship that we should know is that when Rosa Parks was arrested, it led to the Montgomery bus boycott. This was a massive form of protest. Talked about boycotts being a common thing to protest civil rights on the first slide. Here's a clear example of a boycott at work. Boycotts is a way of playing with money. If you boycott a business, you're basically refusing to pay for that business. It's taking away that company's bottom dollar, taking away their money. And so what Black Americans in Montgomery decided to do was to stop paying for the buses. The buses were obviously unequal. They were forcing Black people to give up seats that they rightfully paid for. That was obviously unfair. So why are we paying? Why are they paying for the bus system to exist? It took a year. It took a whole year for something to change, but eventually, after a year of business of the Black community, the buses stopped segregating, and they had to. The second form of protest that I want to cover are sit-ins. So sit-ins is another protest tactics. This was often used by college-age students. And a sit-in is kind of exactly what it sounds like. You sit in a place. You occupy space. You take up space or seats. And what Black people were doing, Black college students were doing, were sitting in white-only lunch counters, white-only restaurants, and just simply asking to be served. The Greensboro Four is a famous example that we covered before in this class of four students who decided to sit in at the Greensboro lunch counter. And that protest movement grew and grew until it wasn't just four of them, it was hundreds. The last form of protests are marches. So a name we should know is John Lewis. He recently passed away in this last year, huge civil rights organizer. He was part of a group called SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Lewis and SNCC held voter registration drives with the goal, of course, of registering as many Black Americans to vote as possible in the South, but that was really difficult because of Jim Crow laws. John Lewis also helped organize the March in Selma, which is a very famous march because those protesters were met with a lot of violence from police. But the goal of the march was to demand voting rights, a key issue during the civil rights movement. We're going to end with one example of a protest you've probably seen and are quite familiar with, which is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I'm having a hard time highlighting evenly, but you get the idea. Martin Luther King gives his "I Have a Dream" speech in this as part of this event. Almost half a million people show up, 250,000 show up to walk the streets of Washington, demand fair and equal treatment, civil rights, voting rights, and much, much more.